Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for today's presentation. My name is Margaret Morton. I'm the Executive Director at ADA, and I'm delighted to be your host today. I would like to start by first acknowledging that I'm hosting this event from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation here in Melbourne. I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which you're all joining us today, and any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in today's event. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and I celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing cultures and connections to the lands and waters across Australia. I will introduce our speakers shortly, but before I do, I would just like to provide you with some brief housekeeping notes, particularly if you've not attended our seminars before. Today's event will be recorded and made available along with the presentation slides afterwards. Today, we will be using the Q&A feature on Zoom to take questions. So please, as you listen, and if you have questions already formed, pop them in the Q&A. We ask you not to put these in the chat. We'd like you to use the chat to share any thoughts or reflections during the presentations. And just a reminder that you do need to select all panelists and attendees in the drop-down menu if you'd like everyone to view your message today. You will be able to upvote the questions that you put in the Q&A by clicking the thumbs up button. And I'll do my best at the end of the session to ask a number of those questions to our speakers today. I would also like to remind you to please be respectful to one another and to our presenters today when posting your comments and questions. I can see that you're all saying hello to one another, which is excellent. So please join me in welcoming our first two speakers at today's seminar. We're joined by Mark Drew, Director, National Capabilities Program, National Emergency Management Agency, which I'll probably just refer to as NEMA for the rest of today. Mark leads the National Capability Program at NEMA, and he builds on his recovery experience and well-established relationships to turn evidence-based policy into action. Mark works with resilience and recovery experts across all levels of government and across the non-government sectors to deliver a range of projects supporting local communities to build capacity and to be better able to respond to, recover from and reduce the impact of future disaster events. Our second first presenter is Wendy Graham. Wendy is the Program Lead Regional Recovery Exercising Program in NEMA. Wendy is an experienced government senior executive with over 20 years experience in the community and emergency management sectors, working across local, state and federal governments and the non-government sector. Wendy has a strong history in emergency management with a focus on community recovery and resilience, and she's currently the NEMA project lead for the Recovery Exercising Toolkit. So our seminar today will begin with two short presentations from Mark and Wendy, who will go through the development of the Recovery Exercising Toolkit and provide us with a walkthrough of the resources that are available. And then we'll move into Q&A with Kimbra, Megan and Richard, who have put this toolkit to them later. So for now, over to you, Mark.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Oh, afternoon, I was going to say morning. For me in Perth, or those others in Perth. Look, thank you very much for taking the time to discuss the Exercising Toolkit, and I'm just going to give a bit of an overview and lead into Wendy's overview of the toolkit itself. Now, with the Royal Commission recommendations and some of the observations, there was a lot of discussion around exercising and the relationship with recovery exercising in particular. As you'd expect in Federation of States, each state and territory is developing their processes and systems, and based on their experiences, their risks, their vulnerabilities, and they've developed over time to meet their needs and a fit for purpose within each state. That coupled with local governments who are always wearing 13 different hats and only just have the time and dollars to deliver core business functions, let alone additional work such as exercising, makes for a varied approach to exercising, and there's a challenging capacity issue, not capability, but capacity issue to draw together all those relevant concepts, research, evidence, and outcomes from reviews into a way that is meaningful for participants and draws out relevant and key considerations for recovery in each context or location. So as you'll see in the next slide, that leads to some challenges around recovery exercising specifically. And just to touch on the importance of why to focus on recovery exercising. Obviously, when we do exercising, often it's about response. It's been, if recovery will be the handover from response to recovery or early relief or early recovery efforts, and that may be in the afternoon session, afternoon tea, just before the hot debrief. So it certainly may be incorporated, but it's not drawing out those recovery over time or deeper considerations for recovery. And with the events we see over the last 12 months, we've seen in 2022 over 50% of Australians impacted by some disaster in some way, shape or form. You've had multiple events impacting multiple in many local government areas, over 430 local governments impacted over the last 3 years with 198 actual disaster events, and some of it disasters of some local governments have seen multiple disasters, double digits impacts for their communities. This means that those complex, more frequent disasters mean that people are recovering not just from one or two, but multiple events, which makes the challenge more complex, more nuanced, and certainly more difficult to manage and address those needs that evolve over time. So recovery is not just the end of the PPRS process, that prevention, preparedness, response, recovery. It's not the end of the story, it's actually the start, and it's the longest phase of that process, and it's certainly the one that has the biggest impact on where people evolve and get to in terms of living, getting back to a life they value living. So sort of touching on some of those key considerations for why you want to recovery exercise and have it as a complement to response. So if we go to the next slide, you'll see with the toolkit, we've tried to address these issues. It's now available on the ADAR website. It became available and published on early February, and it's been 18 months in the development. We've had an advisory group supporting Wendy and I in the development and engaging around content, concepts, and considerations that should be taken into account. We've had subject matter experts on specific modules, such as Michelle Villeneuve and Biami Williamson. And we've been working with traditional stakeholders through the CAUSE, Community Outcomes Recovery Subcommittee, and the Social Recovery Reference Group. So making sure we've got that representation from jurisdictions and local governments to feed into the type of content that will be useful and appropriate. None of which we're talking about here is about replacing the work the states have done. This isn't about supplanting it. This is about providing work that is really drawing all those national resources and concepts into one usable package that is easily accessible for local governments and integrating that material with all the other work that's already available. So go to the next slide, please. So with this, how we've done that is through a series of pilot exercises to test, develop, refine the content and the process. And we've had 3 of those in those locations across 3 states. We've had those involved 14 councils, 126 participants. So that's been fantastic in terms of people developing up their time and also the energy that people provided during those activities to feed into and refine the discussions and the content within each of those modules. And the next slide, please. Where that's taken us is a final product of the Exercising Toolkit. It's really meant as a standalone resource. It's developed to guide exercise planners in the design and conducting a recovery exercise, specifically a recovery exercise, tailored towards 3 to 4 weeks post-event, really honing in on that recovery stages, and contains evidence-based practice and guidance and specialist resources, templates and slides, really providing everything that could be needed to run an exercise and tailor it to a particular location or community or LGA. The dedicated resources, they go beyond immediate relief and into that recovery over time. And by that recovery over time, there's considerations geared towards 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, and 12 months and beyond. And it really is trying to be inclusive, really facilitating engaging with broader community inclusive approaches to planning exercising and bringing that inclusiveness into the exercising process. If you go to the next slide, please. So really, one of the things we're trying to do is step beyond a traditional exercise. This isn't about stress testing a system. It is about encouraging collaborative discussion and engagement across all the stakeholders or practitioners who would normally be in that recovery committee at that local level or district level. It's about strengthening those collaborative discussions and really tailoring those into the challenges that may manifest in that community, drawing the community-based and non-government organisations into the discussion who would normally be supporting an LGA in delivery of recovery, and really we've been working with ADAR and national working groups and specialists in the field, as was saying, to develop those contents. So it very much is pertinent, applicable and appropriate for those practitioners on the ground. And the way it's designed is about having a choose your own adventure sort of approach. So whatever your context is, whatever you want to explore or want to focus on within your exercise, there's a module that can be taken to feed into that and facilitate and guide that discussion. Very much tailored towards all the key recovery considerations that we've seen evolve from those reviews, that whether it be Royal Commission, state-based inquiries, reviews within the relevant IGEMs within Queensland, Victoria, or other reviews that have been internationally conducted. So really feeding that into and refining the content so that it's usable and useful and can be tailored towards what people want to explore. It really is about creating that suite of electives that formulate recovery consideration over time and drawing out those considerations as part of a structured discussion. So go to the next slide, please. And as part of that structured discussion, that really relies on, as I was saying, that local context. So with that disaster event scenario, what we've proposed is right up front having a scenario. It doesn't need to be huge, but it might link to a response scenario that's already been developed, and translating the response scenario into recovery focus. So translating from impact, consequence to evolving community need. So teasing those out and structuring, feeding that into the discussion. Also links directly to what is relevant and appropriate within the state and territory arrangements. So really making sure they're represented and reflected into the discussion and anchoring the context and the process of what recovery looks like in that local area. And also, lastly, looking at the history of disaster. So what's manifested in the community before. So really anchoring that whatever we talk about in the scenario, or whatever someone talks about in that scenario, is relevant and appropriate and is embedded in historic evidence. There's also two core modules, the community recovery over time and the community recovery foundations and recovery over time. Then the electives, which are supporting people with disability in recovery, Indigenous communities in recovery, or foundations of economic recovery. Can we just stuck on to the next slide, please? So as I was saying, the target audience is about those emergency management committees, councils and recovery committees who are responsible for development of recovery plans and recovery practices at that local level, with the people and organisations who would normally be in that committee represented and engaged in the discussion. So it's really about bringing those people together, tailoring a discussion that draws out key considerations for that location and can inform that next steps. So what do we want to develop, or what's the planning for the next 12 months that enables people to be more aware, prepared, and have the appropriate networks for what next event occurs. So really embedding that recovery aspect of the emergency management as a priority within the local government, as well as traditional EM or response activities. Let's skip to the next slide, please. And that is over to Wendy. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mark, and good afternoon, everyone. And I'm speaking to you today from Sydney, from the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my deepest respects to Elders past, present and emerging. What we wanted to do in the next few minutes is give you a very quick Cook's tour of the toolkit itself so that you can see what's in it. Can we go to the next slide, please? Thank you. So the central document within the toolkit is the toolkit companion document, and that really provides an end-to-end guide for anyone who is wanting to run a recovery exercise. And it's an end-to-end guide for the design and conduct of a recovery exercise. Everything that you want to know in terms of how you do it is in that document. Accompanying that document is a facilitator guide, and essentially what that really is a run sheet for a day-long recovery exercises with speaking notes for a facilitator to run through the entire day, each of the components of an exercise day. It's not set in stone. We're not saying that you have to use it, and we're not saying that you have to use the script, but it's so that you don't have to start with a blank page. So much of the principles of the toolkit is take what you need, use it the way that you need to use it, and use it creatively. It's not a rule book. It's a resource for you to be creative in the way that you run exercises. And the facilitator slide deck is, again, it's a slide deck which essentially walks you through the entire day of a recovery exercise, and again, has speaker's notes to accompany that with that. You can drop slides out, you can put slides in. The principle is use it so that it works for you. The next slide, please. As Mark said, there's a number of modules, and you'll find a link to each of those in the toolkit, and he spoke about those before. So I think that we will go to the next slide. One of the modules, we thought what we'd do is give you a bit of a deep dive into one of the modules. It was hard to choose which one to look at right now, but later when the panel talk, they're going to talk about using the supporting people in disability modules. So we'll have a quick look at the working with Indigenous communities in recovery now. Each of the modules that we have developed has very much been a very close and tight partnership with a subject matter expert in each of these different areas. And so in this module, we work very closely with Mayami Williamson from Monash University. And each module has 3 components in it. It's got a module overview, which it really gives you an idea of the content that you will find in that session. It will give you the key messages and the things that are important to know. There is also a slide deck, again, like the facilitator slide deck. It's a slide deck that will help you walk through that presentation. It has speaker's notes that go along with that. I think one of the important things to say is that these modules provide foundational information. Our aim with these modules is that they will provide a level of information that will then encourage emergency management committees, recovery committees, other organisations working in recovery to go on and do more in whatever area that they are looking at. So really the purpose of the module is to provide information and then a call to action. So now you know, what are you going to do? Now the third component in a module is a video, and there's a video in each of the modules, and that's because while we would love to take Biami to every single recovery exercise across the nation, we can't do that, nor can we do it with Michelle Villeneuve with supporting disability. So what we've done is we've videoed them so that they can come to you, and the focus of their discussion in those videos is to really draw out the key messages that are reinforced in the slide deck and the module overview. We thought it would be helpful to actually give you a bit of a look and see into what that video actually looks like. So this video is Biami, and Biami Williamson is a Yuali man from northwest New South Wales with familial ties to northwest Queensland. And he's an academic who focuses on the impacts of disasters on Indigenous peoples, and he conducted case studies into both the bushfires in 1920 and the 22 northern New South Wales floods. And in this video, Biami talks about how disasters disproportionately affect Indigenous people and the importance of building relationships with Indigenous communities before disaster hits. If we can have the video now. It's about 5 minutes, just to let you know. Thank you.
There's three very easy to comprehend ways that demonstrate how disasters impact Indigenous peoples that are different to non-Indigenous peoples. The first is the demographic profile of our population. More than 50% of our population is under the age of 24 years old, with the highest concentration being infants and young children. So what we have is a really bottom heavy, really youthful population, which is a very different age structure to non-Indigenous peoples. And so obviously when disasters hit, the needs of Indigenous communities are going to be different because our profile is fundamentally different. The second one is housing. Generally, the average Indigenous household in Australia has 3 generations of people living in it, being a grandparent, a parent, and then quite a lot of young children as well. And so the needs of households and how to support households in the living arrangements within those households is going to be very, very different to the general needs of non-Indigenous peoples, because the structure of housing and the number of people living in those dwellings is fundamentally different. The third unique way that Indigenous peoples are impacted by disasters is the cultural and heritage rights that exists for Indigenous peoples. And when you've got natural disasters such as bushfires, such as floods, such as cyclones, and drought in particular as well, these have a significant impact on Indigenous peoples' cultural heritage, being physical artifacts, things like scarred trees, stone arrangements, and the like. But also on their ability to enjoy their culture. When rivers dry up, people can't fish, and so it impacts the way their cultural experiences. When you have dreaming stories that are devastated when a bushfire sweeps through, it really impacts and fundamentally distorts the Indigenous people's experiences with their own cultural heritage and with their own history. Indigenous peoples generally have a distrust of government agencies and non-Indigenous organisations, and that distrust has been created through colonisation and the incredibly traumatic experiences that have existed between government agencies in particular and non-government organisations in our communities. So those deep kind of schisms that exist in our society need work to overcome them. And I can think of no more critical place to build those relationships than organisations and people in positions who deal with land and with community. A disaster is not a time to create relationships. Disaster is a time to work with relationships you've already established. And so where you have emergency services, where you've got disaster response agencies and non-government organisations that don't know any Indigenous peoples, that don't know the community organisations, that don't know where they live, that don't know their needs, and don't know the cultural heritage rights that exist in those areas, how on earth can they support those people? They can't. And when they can't support people in a community, the response is a failure, because you are failing the people and you're failing to provide what they need. But within the context of vulnerabilities, the discourse of vulnerabilities, we also miss a lot of the strengths. So some of the strengths are Indigenous communities are really, really close and interdependent. There's a strong ethos of don't leave anyone behind and make sure no one's at a disadvantage, and families that need or individuals that need extra support. Well, you've got community members there and family members that are generally ready to stand up and provide that support in whatever way that looks like. The other significant one, I think, is the existence of community-controlled organisations. So Indigenous communities have an array of organisations that advocate for communities, provide services for the communities, and safeguard and hold on to the rights that Indigenous peoples have. And so when you've got a response needing to pull together a response to disasters in real time, what a fantastic resource for larger agencies, non-government organisations, emergency services agencies to call upon in those disasters, because they've got the information is there at hand, and these organisations can reach community members very quickly, very effectively. There needs to be a sense of reality that it takes time to build relationships, and it takes commitment, and there's more than one relationship you should build in communities as well. So don't expect that you're going to find the first Aboriginal person and they're going to be the fountain of knowledge and all you're going to need to do. Really investigate it, really get out there and make the time and commitment. And in the context of Aboriginal communities, go and have a cup of tea with people. It means a lot.
So I hope you can see how powerfully we're able to use a resource like Biami's video. And within the context of the Recovery Exercise Day, we use the video and then we break into discussion groups. And we've got some fairly confronting questions, particularly for our emergency management committees and our recovery committees to start to think through in terms of the way that our Indigenous communities are included in recovery planning and our recovery discussions. So it is a call to action, and it's been a powerful way to use that. Now, there are many ways to use the toolkit, and as I said before, there's no rules. You can run a standalone recovery exercise, pick a date and run an exercise. Ideally, you can run a recovery exercise day as part of a broader emergency management exercise where you have a day 1 response exercise and a day 2 recovery exercise, which is really taking us to a new place from our historical place of recovery, getting a 40-minute section after lunch and just before afternoon tea on a day. So that's the ideal, that when we start to think about running exercises, we would run a response component and a recovery component. I hope also just showing you the Indigenous module also gives you a sense of there's other ways you can use those modules that don't have to be part of an exercise. So you can use them as workshops or awareness sessions, or as just-in-time training resource when you are setting up a new recovery committee after a disaster event. Next slide, please. So what will success look like? For me, success is when recovery exercising is embedded into emergency management programs and an exercise has a dedicated focus on both response and recovery. And success is when response-only exercises become a thing of our past. Now, remember when. So remember when we didn't wear seatbelts? And remember when we were allowed to smoke on planes? Now, not all of you will remember those things, but I do, and I know some of you do. So trust us, it's true. But what were we thinking? When we look back now, what were we thinking? It seems ludicrous to think about those things now. For me, success looks like when we start to say, remember when we only exercised for response? What on earth were we thinking? When we get there, that's success. Now, you might think that those examples are not particularly relevant. But recovering from a significant disaster is a major, major life event. And the actions and the decisions that we take as emergency and recovery practitioners and committees will impact a person's experience of recovery and indeed how they'll go on to live the rest of their life. And the catastrophic floods and fires that we have seen over recent years have certainly demonstrated that. So supporting communities to recover from disaster is that important, and we need to get it right. Planning and exercising for disaster recovery is as important as planning and exercising for response. So have a look at the toolkit. Use it in a way that will work for you, and have a look at the resources and start including recovery in your exercising. Thank you.
Thank you, Wendy, and thank you, Mark. I've noted in the chat a couple of you had sound issues with the video. Rest assured that you will receive all of this after the seminar today. And so hopefully you'll be able to listen to Biami Williamson's video if you weren't able to hear it properly today. So let's get even more practical than that. In November 2022, City of Hobart Council partnered with NEMA to run a recovery discussion exercise. Kimbra Parker, Manager Community Programs, Megan Cunningham, Accessible City Coordinator, and Richard Whitbrook, Project Coordinator from Disability Voices Tasmania, are now going to share their insights from their involvement in a recovery exercise using this Recovery Exercising Toolkit. So please join me in welcoming our first panellist, which is Kimbra Parker, Manager Community Programs, City of Hobart Council. So Kimbra was responsible for initiating and organising the Hobart Recovery Exercise. And so I thought I'd throw a question at you, Kimbra. Why did City of Hobart Council decide to conduct a recovery exercise? What were they hoping to achieve?
Thanks, Margaret, and hello to everyone online. We're coming to you from Nipaluna, Hobart, the land of the Palawa people, and I pay my respects to elders past and present, and also to Aboriginal people on the call with us today. There are a range of reasons why the City of Hobart decided to approach NEMA to see if we could have a recovery exercise in Hobart. As the city's social recovery coordinator for many, many years, I'd noticed we'd done a lot of planning and a lot of exercises in regards to evacuation centre delivery. What we do in that initial response phase, but really not a lot in the longer term recovery. Personally, I'd been involved in a Southern Tasmania emergency event where we'd been in the evacuation centre, but not actually had any of that direct experience as to what happens after that. So I felt that we were missing that longer term recovery, and I'd raised that in a lot of forums that I'd been at. Can we actually do some practice and some exercise in this work, and kind of really being clear what each agency's role is in this space. In June 23, I was lucky enough to be invited to the NEMA recovery exercise in the east coast of Tasmania in St Helens. And I think it kind of brought all my thoughts together in terms of what we were missing. That was an amazing exercise. It really covered everything that we knew we had to kind of have in our minds, but that we weren't really clear about. So it went through the short, medium, long-term recovery actions and across the 4 domain areas, because often we don't actually name up that it is infrastructure, it is economic, it is environmental as well as social. So we realised from that there was a couple of us from the south of the state, but predominantly that exercise was for the East Coast community, and we felt that we need to share those learnings and be prepared down in Hobart and in southern Tasmania. The timing of the exercise also coincided with changes with our state government. So state government had just created a Resilience and Recovery Tasmania unit. So they were also in a new phase, and so they were really happy to kind of partner with us to deliver the exercise. So we really delivered it in a partnership model across the 3 tiers of government. What we were hoping to achieve from this was kind of like that shared understanding of what our roles and responsibilities are. Even though we're a small geographical area and in Tassie, you know, everyone still does work in their own areas, and we don't have enough of that collaboration. We work really closely with our Southern Tasmania Recovery and Emergency Management team, but again, that focus tends to be in that response phase and not the recovery phase. We are very siloed, and we really needed a way to kind of break through that and all be in the same room together. The other thing we wanted to develop was the stronger relationships with NEMA. You know, being a small council at the bottom of Australia, you know, sometimes it's hard to get those relationships formed, but that was really important to us, and to build the relationships with our local NEMA representatives as well. State government and councils, you know, we're kind of in the same room sometimes, but not often. So again, it was about building the relationship with our state government agencies and kind of broadening the relationships with our other councils and community partners. For us as a council, we've also been through a restructure process. So we've got a lot of new staff members on board. So we wanted to make sure also within our own organisation there was an understanding of each individual role and responsibility in that planning and recovery space. When we talked to Wendy in the first instance of establishing that we were going to do the exercise, for council, having the ability to bring in the toolkit for people with disabilities was also for us a big element. As a council, we're very responsive and very aware of having the voice of lived experience in all our planning and all our work. And particularly in the area of people with disabilities, we've had an access committee involving people with lived experience for over 25 years. So we hear their voice, but we knew that we needed to kind of elevate that and make sure other people heard those voices as well. So we're really pleased to have that as part of our module.
Brilliant. And I want us to go to Megan and Richard in just a moment, but I'm wondering if there are 1 or 2 key lessons that you learned from the experience, or things that you know, surprised you or impressed you at the time, if there are some things you'd just like to share.
I think probably one of the biggest things was the lack of awareness in the room. So it wasn't like, you know, you often go to things and you're hearing the same thing again. It was, you could see the light bulb moments around the room of actually this does apply to me. And that recovery is not just that short term, that this could go on for years, and that, you know, business as usual is not going to be an option for a lot of those people in the room if things do get real. I think we work closely with our community organisations in social recovery space, but we really focused on mapping the community organisations and the agencies that would be involved in the other areas of recovery. So being able to kind of bring them into the space and kind of establish those relationships was a really big outcome for us. The power of the storytelling and the case studies. So in our evaluations, that came through really strongly. Was that when you actually bring a case story and a face into the discussions, that it really does have that relevance. It's so very powerful, as Wendy mentioned before. And I think for us also the learning is the support from NEMA. So along it, you know, there's a fair bit of work that does go into, you know, into the day, but we were very handheld the whole way through. And Wendy and Mark, you know, really supported us. So we never felt like we were on our own doing this work. All the slides, the toolkits, everything was kind of provided in a way that made that really easy for us. So we came out of that feeling really supported and really glad that we went down that path.
And that, in a nutshell, I think is the value of a webinar like this, because looking at the materials, and I can see in the chat, people are saying this all looks fantastic, but for you to be able to say, yes, it was easy to then work together and do this is great. So thanks, Kimbra. Stay tuned, and we'll see if there are other questions coming forward from the watching participants. I would like now, though, to introduce Megan and Richard. So welcome to the seminar, Megan and Richard. Megan, as I said earlier, is the Accessible City Coordinator for City of Hobart Council, and Richard is the Project Coordinator for Disability Voices Tasmania. Together they planned and co-facilitated the elective module on supporting people with disability in recovery. So a question first, and you can work out between you, you can nudge each other, I think, for how you'd like to answer these. Can you just give us a little bit of a story, share your experience of using the toolkit resources, the overview, the slide deck and the video, and how that helped you prepare and co-facilitate that part of the presentation?
Thanks, Margaret, and hello everyone. We're both really excited to be here today. I guess I'll probably start. For me, the toolkit was a really great resource, and as Kimbra mentioned, it assisted the City of Hobart to hold a community recovery forum exercise last year in November. And all of the information in the toolkit and the presenter's notes are just really easy to access and understand. And the toolkit provided evidence-based resources and templates and slides. So as a presenter, there was an element of confidence about using the information and being able to tailor that to the needs within our group and within Hobart. And Kimbra mentioned this, the toolkit provided an opportunity for City of Hobart officers and emergency stakeholders to have a dedicated time to focus on community recovery and explore and discuss the issues. So it was great to be able to bring people together and to be able to present and have opportunities for people to discuss in groups and also ask questions. And what was really great was that the module actually highlights the strengths and the needs of people with disability and their capability to contribute to this space, to emergency management and recovery planning. Kimbra briefly mentioned as well that the toolkit provided information and scenarios, and it got people to have a think about what some of the challenges might be. And one of the deliverables was about the importance of actually building strong relationships with disabled people's organisations or DPOs and community services. And I think that was what was really great about being able to work with Richard from Disability Voices Tasmania and co-present together, because Richard had been leading a community engagement project and asking and was the voice of people with disability. So I might now hand over to Richard to add to that.
Thank you, Megan. Yeah, just to reiterate, I thought the videos that we used, I think we used the Queensland flood example, and I thought that was relevant Australia-wide, just in terms of some of the issues raised. Also, I thought having utilised Michelle as an expert in the field in people-centred emergency management or preparedness, give credence to the actual toolkit as well. As Megan said, Disability Voices Tas had been undergoing a project in relation to this as well, so it actually fed in was very timely, and we were able to adapt and be flexible in terms of the slides used and the information provided. And I thought it provided us with a great opportunity not only to say these are the issues of which I noticed a lot of people in the room thought weren't even aware that that might be an issue, and i.e. evacuation centres and so forth. That it started a conversation, and I think if nothing else, it starts a conversation. The main part I thought was it's co-design. We have to be part of the decision-making process, and that toolkit and that training facilitation actually aids that. And from that Disability Voices Tas point of view, it's actually encouraged a few other conversations since then. So I found it very beneficial. I think just reiterating it, what part of that was just we want to see integration. We don't want disability seen as an afterthought in the whole emergency process. So remember when, I hope to think that afterthought language will cease in a very near future. So that provided us with that opportunity.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Richard. And the sound is dropping out in and out just a little bit, but as one of my team has put into the chat, please don't be concerned, anybody. You will get a chance to have a look at this again. I'm catching everything you're saying. It's just a little bit soft from time to time. So it goes to the last question, though. I was going to ask the two of you your final remark there, Richard, about do you want to add anything about why co-facilitating this presentation is such an important part of the exercise day? And I think part of the answer is what you just said about not being an afterthought. Are there other reasons or other things you'd just like to highlight about why it mattered so much to you to do this presentation as part of the day?
Yeah, so having someone with a disability actually voice their experiences, as opposed to able-bodied or an expert to say this is what will happen. People sharing their experiences or how people might design an evacuation or recovery without input from people with disability is not going to work. So this toolkit enables input for people with disability and others to listen to go, okay, how can we design a better recovery emergency management system that's going to encompass everybody and hopefully de-stress or less stress for everyone.
Yep.
Just on that as well, I think what was really great was we obviously collected feedback from the participants, and it was from the participants that they were saying how great it was to have scenarios and videos and to hear from Richard and the work that Disability Voices Tasmania had been doing. So I guess for me, that was what was really amazing about being able to co-present. And we also spent some time in the lead up to the presentation actually having a look at the module. And as Wendy mentioned, we obviously wanted to use every slide because they were all fabulous. But we obviously looked at it, and I felt a sense of confidence being able to talk to Richard and say, what do we want to use? How do we kind of want to put them together? Do we want to move around how we do them? How much time do we want to spend on group work? And it was just really fabulous to be able to share that with somebody so that we had the voice of the people in the room. As Wendy said, we would love to bring everybody to the table to every session that we hold. And sometimes that is tricky, but having those videos and scenarios certainly was really fabulous. Or that lived experience was right there at the forefront, and there was a focus at a local level.
Fabulous. Thank you both, Megan and Richard. And now I want all three of you to just kind of stay with me. I have a question for all three of you, and you don't all have to answer it, but if you just kind of wave at me, it'd be great to get your reflections a little. I'm sure there are people online from other councils around the country. What advice would you give to others, to councils, to emergency management committees, to any organisations considering using this material or conducting a recovery exercise? Any learnings where you go, yep, I've got a piece of advice before you start?
You go, Megan.
So probably for mine is like it seems quite daunting. It is there's a lot of theory that sits behind it, and it is fully evidence-based, and that daunting when you first look at it, but it is just that that Wendy and Mark have got your hand the whole time. So I think it's just that confidence to be able to do it, and to allow the time for it. So we had a 1-day session. I think giving it a really good lead time is really important to make sure, because the people you're getting in the room are often the very busy people, making sure that you put it at a time out so that you do get the maximum participation, and giving it enough time, because even with a full day, we're all kind of walking out feeling we could have really shared more. So I suppose it's just, giving it the energy that it needs.
Thanks, Kimbra. Anything from Megan or Richard?
I guess also for me, definitely host a session and use the toolkit, and also spend some time thinking about the key stakeholders. And I guess when Richard and I were thinking about it, we kept coming back to that point around we wanted to build the understanding that inclusive planning is everyone's responsibility. But like Kimbra was saying, it can feel overwhelming. But certainly if you sort of can use that toolkit to sort of tailor it to the audience and ensure that they have this sense of being able to ask questions and kind of problem solve together. So people walk away feeling like they've been able to take the theory and put that into some kind of action and feel really motivated that when they leave the room, that something's going to happen from that.
And just to add to that, I suppose I have spoken about the co-design process, including us at the start, reach out to people with disability, organisations. They'll be able to assist. You'll get honest feedback on what works and what doesn't, and part of that will be hopefully a system. It's not going to happen overnight with some of this stuff, but you'll get a better system and a better response in terms of, I suppose, less stress and hopefully better outcomes than I had, say, 10, 15 years ago. And I think it can't be emphasised enough that, yeah, you just need to include people with disability from the start to come up with, hopefully, solutions that will work for everybody.
Agreed, Richard. And if Biami was physically present or online with us now, he'd say the same for Indigenous peoples. So that's a lovely way to end this particular component of today. We are running out of time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move to the Q&A. And if anyone wants to add questions, I'm going to work out which ones of these are the most popular questions. I can answer the first one fairly easily. There will be slides. The slides today will be part of what's sent out to participants after this session. Welcome back, Mark and Wendy. Look, a very popular question. I'm tempted to answer it myself, but I'll get you to answer it. A very popular question is this one. Is there a way to get an education module put into emergency management training, recovery exercises and procedures relating to preparedness and recovery for people with disability, CALD, Indigenous, etc., to have a dedicated unit of training, just not a reference in an occasional seminar? I think that's basically the purpose of the entire project. But would anyone like to say anything about that question? A lot of people have supported me asking that question.
I might be able to jump in briefly, Margaret, in terms of certainly agree with what you've that's the intent behind that and the drivers. And we've tried to start doing work on that with one of the other programs we're doing, which is a National Recovery Training program that is developed a Cert 3 and diploma in training is in the vet sector, and that it went live in the PUA Release 5 December of last year. And what we're now exploring is how to establish and build some of that content into the actual product design or course design. You know, taking the skills and competencies identified, which definitely link to what you're talking about and what's being raised, into actual content, experience, and really contextualizing that into the recovery space. So we've certainly heard that and working toward it.
Thanks, Mark. I'm going to hope that's actually oh no, I have to move my chat window to see if nobody else is really waving at me. So I'm going to assume that's a really great answer. Thank you, Mark. I have another question and it's for you, Kimbra. So everyone else can just relax for a moment. It's actually from, I'm going to slightly out the asker. It's actually from the Council of Social Service down in Tassie, and I think it's a really good question. And from my work with various organisations like the various causes, they'll have similar questions. Who do you think needs to initiate and drive the closer relationship or partnership between local government, state government, emergency services and the community services for this to work?
Oh, that is a big question. You know, obviously there's got to be the collaboration across all those agencies. A good example was through the COVID emergency. For us in Tasmania, TasCOS was a leading light in that space. We found that the information sharing and actually, combining all of our thoughts in that space was really challenging. And TasCOS took a lead, supported by state government. So state government funded that agency to do that work. It worked really well, although local government, it was a little bit of a confusing where local government sat in that. We've provided a lot of feedback post that emergency in that we need to get this set up pre. It needs to be led, to me, it needs to be led from state government in the new Resilience and Recovery Agency. There needs to be their leadership, and then all the other agencies feed into that.
Yeah. And if I could also add a tiny semi-answer to the question, I actually think anyone can start the conversation. So I don't think we need to wait to work out who should start the conversation. I think because anyone can start it. Look, I'm very conscious of time, but Mark, I'm going to throw you one more question because it specifically says for Mark. Great work with the work to date, so that's good. Did you find any difficulty getting buy-in from first response organisations, NGOs, LGAs when conducting the exercises? And actually, once Mark's answered, anyone else can also go, I'd like to add to that.
Look, that's a great question. And I think several years ago, you were saying, yes, we have. But now I think there's a strong understanding, and certainly a growing understanding of that these needs to be really joined up, and they're intrinsically linked. And as we've been working with the development of the scenarios and talking to the first responders who've developed up some wonderful response scenarios, they were very happy to engage, collaborate, and stayed with the workshop. We had a couple of people saying, oh, we'll do the morning session and wait for the response and see if there's any content or questions we can answer to help with it. But they cancelled their afternoon meetings and stayed the entire day. So they really saw value. And so the type of things they were talking about was, we can see some of the things you've been asking for us, or other people on the recovery side have been asking for us in terms of content, information, or activity, and how it really links to that longer term sort of thinking. And I can see the value add. I can see actually where I can make a bigger difference. So they were taking that back into their discussions on the ground as well. So to date, it's been fantastic.
Brilliant. Would anyone like in 30 seconds to add to that, and then I'll have to close the seminar? No, we're all good.
Probably just a quick one from me was, we probably struggled a little bit in, engaging the economic space in terms of the agencies and organisations. For us in Tassie, that was a bit more of the challenge. I don't think that economic recovery was in people's thoughts. So we did struggle in that space to get the engagement compared to the other recovery domains.
Yep. Look, that is all we have time for today. We could talk for longer, I'm sure. I would like to thank most sincerely Mark, Wendy, Kimbra, Megan and Richard for speaking with us today. It's given us a lot to think about, and I thank you for your participation. For anyone in the audience who's interested in finding out more about how to apply the Recovery Exercising Toolkit, don't hesitate to reach out to the team in ADA. If you have any further questions, you'll find a contact email in the chat box. On behalf of ADA, I thank you all for joining us today. You will soon be sent a short survey. We do use the information in these surveys to refresh and review our performance as we do these professional development events. So please do tell us what you think. It's been my pleasure to host you all this afternoon. Until we see you next, stay safe and farewell.